filing this Perceptions of Pacific Research, which I'm going to shortly ask Joanna Bourke to talk about, the CEO from the Pacific Cooperation Foundation. So Joanna's going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, introducing the research. And then following that, I'm really pleased to say we've got an excellent lineup here of dignitaries and experts to discuss both the research findings and the event theme. And I'll introduce them briefly now. The Honourable Carmel Sepuloni will be well known to you as the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and the Labour MP for Kelston in West Auckland. She was previously served as Minister for Social Development and Employment, Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, Minister for Auckland, Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, and Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs, focused on the Pacific region. She also served as the 20th Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, the first Pacific woman and the third woman in total in that role. We've also got Mr. Sione Teketeke, Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the Auckland University of Technology. He's previously spent 9 years serving in the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, most recently as Director for Governance and Engagement. Worked in the Pacific for over 20 years in prominent political advisory and strategic policy roles, and has extensive expertise in public international law, strategic engagement, diplomacy, regional security, and democratic governance. And we're also very pleased to have Sarah Fetuani speaking this evening. Sarah is a law student at the University of Auckland, an active member of the Auckland branch of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, and her interests and expertise centre on the Pacific region, its peoples, including New Zealand, with a strong commitment to promoting good governance and leadership, and a keen interest in security theory and law in the Pacific region. So I won't delay any further. I'll ask Joanne to come up and present the research for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion and a Q&A. And I would encourage you all to think up some interesting questions as we go. So thank you, Joanne.
Yeah, it works. Kia ora koutou, maloa lelei, and good evening to everyone. It really is a pleasure to stand here this evening to discuss Closing the Connection Gap, New Zealanders, the Pacific and Global Affairs. On the screen is the title, highlighting that tonight I'm going to share data insights from our 2025 Perceptions of New Zealanders of the Pacific report. These findings offer a timely lens on how Kiwis view our Pacific neighbourhood in the changing world. And as CEO of PCF, I'm excited to walk through these insights and why they matter. By the end, I hope we'll see not just the numbers, but the story they tell and how it sets the stage for our panel on regional cooperation, cultural exchange, and New Zealanders' evolving role in the Pacific. Here, I want to frame why this report matters now. The Pacific is central to Aotearoa's New Zealand's identity, security, and future prosperity. It's not peripheral to us. It is us. Yet our engagement is at an inflection point. Shifts in global power and regional dynamics are reshaping how we engage across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. Great powers are paying more attention to the Pacific than ever before, bringing both opportunities and challenges. At the same time, the pandemic has altered our connections, reminding us of both our interdependence and the fragility of links like travel and supply chains. And of course, climate change is escalating urgency. The Pacific is on the front lines of this grave threat, grappling with rising seas and extreme weather that threaten communities. In short, this is a moment to reflect on our role and renew our commitment. This report provides a timely pulse check on how New Zealanders see and value our Pacific relationships today. It asks, are we as connected as we think? Where must we do better? These questions couldn't be more relevant as we navigate a post-COVID era of complexity and interdependence. This slide shows two sets of data. On the left, a list of perceived strengths, and on the right, figures on our regional influence. New Zealanders overwhelmingly recognise areas where Aotearoa contributes strongly to the Pacific. According to the survey, the top perceived strength is economic development, cited by 88% of respondents. Nearly as many highlighted cultural exchange and education as areas where New Zealand makes a positive impact. Even environmental support and governance assistance are widely seen as strengths. In other words, Kiwis largely feel that New Zealand has been a force for good in our Pacific neighbourhood across development, culture and more. On the right, we see perceptions of influence in the region. 67% of New Zealanders say New Zealand has significant influence in the Pacific, slightly more than the proportion who say the same of Australia. Interestingly, only 39% see China as having significant influence in the Pacific, suggesting that our Kiwis still view our traditional partners as the dominant players. However, there is a note of caution. When asked about the future, a mere 6% are very confident that New Zealand will maintain that influence long term. That low confidence likely reflects awareness of rising competition and challenges ahead. In fact, survey respondents flagged key risks to New Zealand's role. 28% pointed to competing powers, like China. 23% worried the Pacific as out there, rather than integral to New Zealand. As the quote says, our Pacific identity is recognised, but not lived everywhere. The younger generation seems to be growing up with a more Pacific-aware mindset, likely influenced by more diverse school curricula, Pacific media representation and friendships across cultures. Meanwhile, some older Kiwis may not have had the same exposure. This highlights a chance for education and engagement, initiatives targeted by generation. If we can harness the openness of youth and also bring older generations along, we can foster a more uniformly Pacific conscious society. The encouraging part is that identity is not fixed. It can evolve. With leadership and inclusion, we can help more New Zealanders, young and old, truly live our Pacific identity in daily life, not just acknowledge it in theory. What builds connections? The keys to closing the gap. There are 3 bullet points shown, well actually there's more, but the 3 main bullet points shown on this slide each illustrate a factor that significantly boosts connection with some multipliers and percentages. This is about how we turn that goodwill into genuine connection. The data identifies a few powerful drivers. Direct experience matters. New Zealanders who have had a direct personal experience in the Pacific, whether it's through travel, work or education, are 2.5 times more likely to feel connected to the region. There's no substitute for being there and forming real relationships. When you or I visit a Pacific island or work with our Pacific communities, it deepens understanding in a way nothing else can. Cultural engagement increases empathy. Simply engaging with Pacific cultures at home, like attending festivals, enjoying our Pacifica food, or participating in community events, can increase people's empathy by 40%. That's a sizable jump. It shows that every day, cultural exchange builds understanding. Even if someone hasn't travelled to the islands, experiencing Pacific art, music, or hospitality here at home can bridge that distance. Visibility of Pacific success is key. Perhaps the strongest driver identified is representation. Seeing Pacific people in leadership and hearing Pacific success stories boosts pride and connection more than even geographic proximity. In fact, our report notes that visibility of Pacific leadership is the single strongest factor in growing Pacific pride and connection to New Zealanders. This suggests that when Pacific achievements are highlighted, whether it's artists, entrepreneurs, sports heroes, or community leaders, it resonates widely and makes us all feel closer and more invested. As the slide concludes, when I find it, connection grows through contact, experience, and representation. If we want to close the connection gap, we should create more opportunities for Kiwis to have contact with the Pacific, be it through travel or welcoming communities here to experience Pacific cultures in everyday life and to see Pacific peoples leading and succeeding on the national stage. This slide presents statistics under the headings of public sense of responsibility and a call for partnership and leadership. It has a few key numbers about climate action, migration, culture, and media. The overarching message is that New Zealanders feel a strong sense of responsibility toward the Pacific and want to do more. First, 77% of Kiwis believe New Zealand has a responsibility to support Pacific nations. This is a solid majority, reflecting the idea that as a developed Pacific country and neighbour, we should play a helping role. It is not a fringe view, it's mainstream. On the right side, the slide lists specific areas where the public is calling for greater action or partnership. For example, 63% want New Zealand to do more to help Pacific countries adapt to climate change. We know why climate change is an existential threat in the Pacific, and Kiwis are saying we can't stand by. Similarly, 82% see Pacific migrants as essential contributors to our communities, a really heartening recognition of the value the Pacific diaspora brings to New Zealand. Over 70% agree that understanding Pacific cultures enriches our own national identity, showing people appreciate that Pacific cultures are part of who we are as New Zealand. And 58% believe our media should showcase more Pacific success stories. Tying back to the point about representation, the public wants more Pacific voices and achievements in our news and narratives. The slide quotes, New Zealanders overwhelmingly support the Pacific, but connection remains shallow, and that New Zealanders want deeper partnership. They just need pathways and leadership to live it. In other words, the goodwill is there. People are essentially saying, we're on board, we care, now let's translate that into action. It's a call to our leaders, policymakers, educators, media, and all of us to provide those pathways that turn support into deeper engagement. This slide lists priority areas and percentages of respondents who support each. It directly answers the question, given everything we've seen, where do New Zealanders think we should focus our efforts to deepen our Pacific relationships? The survey results highlight several opportunities ranked by support. 58% support increasing economic and trade partnerships. The top response was to boost economic ties. Kiwis want to see more trade, investment and development partnerships with Pacific nations. This could mean supporting Pacific businesses, fair trade deals, or helping create jobs and growth in the islands. 47% support enhancing educational and exchange programs. Nearly half prioritise education and people exchanges. That might involve scholarships for Pacific students, exchange programs for young New Zealanders, or joint research and training initiatives. Education builds long-term connections and skills on both sides. 45% support improved diplomatic and political engagement. New Zealanders also want government to step up its diplomatic game, visiting more, listening more, being present in regional forums, and working closely with Pacific leaders. 45% support greater healthcare support, equal to diplomacy. Many see health collaboration as key, helping Pacific nations with medical expertise, health systems strengthening, and perhaps more medical aid or joint public health initiatives. 44% want to see strengthening of cultural and kinship ties. 43% want to see strengthening of infrastructure, that's technical expertise, roads and energy. New Zealanders see a role in us helping build vital infrastructure in Pacific nations, from clean energy projects to connectivity. And 40% support for climate change and environmental initiatives. Overall, these responses show a comprehensive picture. New Zealanders aren't thinking of engagement in just one dimension. They're seeing economic, educational, diplomatic, health, cultural, infrastructure, and environmental cooperation all as very important. This aligns with the idea of a holistic partnership with the Pacific. Our people are essentially saying, let's invest across the board in people and systems and shared growth. These are exactly the kinds of areas that can close the connection gap by turning awareness into concrete collaboration. This slide, it's like having a roadmap of initiatives to actually bridge the gap. Having seen what the public prioritises, this is about how we might implement and live out these priorities. These points include cultural literacy and education, Pacific-led climate partnerships, fair migration and labour initiatives, strengthening long-term people-to-people ties, and Pacific-led climate partnership. Nearly there. The final slide displays a statement: Aotearoa in the Pacific, a partner, not a bystander. This is the ultimate takeaway I want to leave you with tonight. All the insights we've covered point to a simple truth. New Zealand cannot afford to be a passive bystander in the Pacific. We are and must be an active partner. Our people recognise this. Our Pacific neighbours expect this, and our shared future demands it. The phrase on the slide captures that ethos. Aotearoa as a partner, standing along Pacific nations rather than observing from the sidelines. In closing, the data we've seen tonight is both a reality check and a call to action. Yes, there is a connection gap. New Zealanders care about the Pacific deeply, but many don't yet feel deeply connected. The good news is we also have the ingredients to close the gap: public support, clear priorities, and examples of what builds connection. It's now about leadership and follow through. Our challenge and opportunity is to convert that 87% valuing the Pacific into 87% feeling connected to the Pacific. That means investing in a relationship or in relationships, in knowledge and in reciprocity, treating Pacific nations not as charity cases or strategic chess pieces, but as true partners in our region. I'm confident that with these insights and the commitment of people like you here tonight, we can move forward from reflection to renewal, from awareness to action. Maloa pito, and thank you for listening. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that very clear and perceptive outlay of what is a really valuable piece of research. And I really particularly like how not only have you outlaid some problems and issues with the connection gap, but with some potential solutions. And it'd be great to maybe unpack that a little bit in the discussion to come. But perhaps if I could just start maybe with the Honourable Carmel Sepuloni and the other panellists subsequently to just get your initial reflections on the research, what really struck you and what you think could be really taken forward out of the data.
Sure. Does this work? I think you can hear me. I'm a former teacher, so talofa lava malolele, and thank you for the invitation to come along. Not only am I a politician, I am a Pacific politician. So many of you will know that I'm of Samoan, Tongan, New Zealand, European descent, married a Fijian, just to mix it up a little bit, with an older son who has Niuean whakapapa. So I am very Pan-Pacific, and it's a privilege to be here this evening. I was really interested in reading the report and seeing some of the findings. There are a number of things that really stood out for me, but a few that jumped out were firstly, the value placed on the contribution made and the value of Pacific migrants being around 82%. I don't know if it would have been that 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so for me, as a Pacific person, as a Pacific politician, I was heartened that that was the attitude that presented through the data. And I think that that shows some progress, a heightened level of acceptance for the contribution Pacific people have made over the many decades that they have been living and working in Aotearoa. Sure, there is certainly some progress that still needs to be made, but focusing on the positive, I actually think that that is progress compared to what many of us have experienced over the course of our lifetimes, and retrospectively when we look back at the attitudes that are presented towards Pacific people living and working in New Zealand. So that was heartening. I was also really interested in the perceptions of who has influence over the Pacific. Again, heartened that New Zealanders think that New Zealand ranks highly there. Of course, Australia. Then China. Many of us will know that there are other countries via overseas development assistance through grants that make a much higher level of contribution to the Pacific. Perhaps that's quieter. Perhaps the geopolitical nature of what's happening in the Pacific doesn't put a spotlight on their contribution. I'm thinking about countries like Japan and the contribution they make to the Pacific region. Perhaps it's what New Zealanders see in the media in terms of who is making a contribution and has influence in the Pacific. Is it perceived or is it real? And I think, those are questions to ask as well. And so I found that really interesting. And then the other point, there's many things I found interesting in this report, but the other point that I found really interesting was that New Zealanders saw as a priority area the need to invest in education, skills and training. A bit of a personal area of interest for me, given New Zealand's relationship with the Pacific, the numbers of Pacific leaders that have had an educational experience here in New Zealand and the way in which that has influenced their sense of feeling towards our country and the impact that that has had on the relationship, but also in light of labour mobility and the fact that, yes, there are examples where New Zealand is experiencing skill shortages, so is the Pacific, health workforce being one of them, where I worry sometimes that we are taking, but are we giving back? And are we investing to the extent that we should be on education, skills and training? And are we focused on two-way labour mobility, or is it just New Zealand continuing to fill the gaps which we have in terms of our workforce and taking what really is still needed in all of our Pacific countries? And so wanting a bit more of a discussion, I think, in that space around that, but really interested in the fact that New Zealanders still see that as a priority. So investing in education, skills and training in the Pacific.
That's great points there. Sione, was there anything that really stood out or surprised you about the research? What did you make of it?
I thought it was very interesting. And I think the findings are sort of in alignment with what I sort of had in mind, without even seeing the data. I do think that perhaps a few things need to be unpacked with regards to the findings. So, for example, when we talk about the Pacific, we're talking about a region, for example, with 25% of the world's languages, right? We're talking, but yet we're talking about under 1% of the world's population. So it's a very diverse region. And because of that, when we're talking Pacific, are we talking the whole Pacific, or are we talking predominantly Samoa, Tonga, Polynesia, and perhaps Fiji, and a few other countries? Because my feeling is it's probably the latter. We don't really think about Micronesia and perhaps broader Melanesia. So I think that probably requires unpacking a little bit more. Secondly, I think it's very interesting when we talk about connections and value, because I think it goes to a more critical point about perceptions, how we perceive the Pacific and how the Pacific perceives New Zealand. So, for example, those in the grassroots in New Zealand, in the Pacific, they see New Zealand as an opportunity, as a doorway to greater prosperity, education for their kids. Here in New Zealand, we almost see the Pacific almost like a social responsibility, a cultural responsibility, because they're part of us. So I think those nuances, particularly if we're thinking about it from a policy perspective, is very important. Because some of that as well, when we're talking about perceptions, there's a related element regarding narratives. Because in the Pacific, there's narratives you hear when you talk to people in the village, and then there's the broader political narrative that politicians use to drive, for example, advocacy around climate change, to try and gain agency. And that's also important when we're considering these issues around perception. The other thing I would say is that when we're looking at perception, it's also very important to understand that there's different elements. So, for example, the World Bank does some perceptions around governance through some of the governance indicators. And they say that whilst the Pacific is sort of improving, there's still a perception around governance issues, political instability. There's also perceptions around the economic environment of the Pacific nations themselves, where ADB is highlighting there's a slight improvement, but there's anxious about, for example, growing debt, right? Growing dependency. So that also needs to be accounted for, particularly when we're looking at policy initiatives that you're not embedding dependency, but looking at ways in which you can try and empower Pacific, particularly through private sector businesses and so forth. Trade is interesting because trade in the Pacific hasn't really worked. And I think with PACER Plus, there's some gains there, but generally because we think of the Pacific is not the same, it's very diverse. So trade tends to work with the larger economies. Papua New Guinea, Fiji, doesn't really work with microstates that don't really have an economic base. And that also relates to labor mobility. Because when we're talking labor mobility, what you find with the very, very small microstates is that when they depart, there's really no filler in terms of who's filling the gap in country. It's a bit different from when you're talking Fiji and some of the bigger countries where what happens is mobility comes to New Zealand or Australia, then you have labor coming in, Southeast Asia, for example, Asia and others who are filling that gap. So I think that's also critical. And probably one last point goes to connection, because I think if we're talking New Zealand, culturally, there's no other country in the world that's culturally connected to the Pacific than New Zealand. And you can see that just when you go to South Auckland and others, it's deeply connected. But I do think there's a disconnect at the political level. And there's a disconnect in the foreign policy issues, particularly with what Pacific countries think and what New Zealand thinks. And that's the issue that we really need to talk about. Thank you.
Fascinating points. Thank you, Sione. Sarah, what were your initial thoughts?
I think Sione and Camille have touched
Do
on.
you mind? Because
those
we're
major
recording, so we might
sorry.
just.
Sorry. I think Camille and Sione have touched on those points that are important, and I agree, totally agree. I want to put that into perspective because I think of relationship and influence and how important they are to the Pacific. So we have these, Sione talk about perceptions, and it's always two-way. New Zealand's perceptions to the Pacific perceptions to New Zealand, to have that strong relationship. And I want to share a story about the ROC Worker Training Program. I did some research about 2.5 years ago on ROC Worker. And the program, you have these workers coming to the Pacific, and they do these courses, these short courses. And I came upon a photo that was run by Waka Messina and on behalf of AMFIT and Horticulture New Zealand. We know how valuable the RSC workers to New Zealand horticulture industry. But what I came across is a photo of this Pacific lady with a breakfast platter. And for me, I'm just wondering, because the whole purpose of this worker training program is the idea is that the RSC workers will learn meaningful and transferable skills that will see tangible benefits to their home countries. And I asked that question, what skills will this lady will take back to her country? And I think that just proven the point of that connection gap, on the lack of knowledge of Pacific people. The Pacific people, they're in the islands, they have experience in agriculture. The women have experience in weaving and cooking, but to have that certificate in that photo presenting making breakfast platter, a certificate in cookery, I have a lot of questions in accreditation and just the impacts of those kind of initiatives that New Zealand have on the Pacific. And that just proved for me the point of the report. There's that missing connection, and the connection gap is the lack of knowledge. Because the RSC conference, there was an RSC conference a month ago, and many questions were asked on accreditation issues, on literacy issue, because many of these RSC workers, English is their second language, maybe the ability to understand what's on their pay slips, the deductions, and all those issues of accommodations. Because ANU did a report, just one last point, Hamish, did a report that only 58% of the pay of RSC workers remit back to their families and communities back home, after you make all those deductions. And I think that's, I'm really focused on the impacts. I'm really focused on the result. And policy is fine, initiatives are okay, but where does that lead? Does it make impacts and add values to Pacific people? So that's all I want to add.
We hear a lot of talk and a lot of commentary and scholarship about Pacific-led approaches to some of the problems in the Pacific, like security, like climate change, and so forth. Be interesting to get some views on whether we think Pacific-led, what is that? How do you describe it? And what does it actually mean in practice? Does someone here want to kick us off? Like Sione, what's your view on the sort of Pacific-led phrase and its value, and whether it can be implemented perhaps in New Zealand's way of thinking?
I think it's an interesting one because I think it's sector-driven. So, for example, in academia, there's a lot of Pacific-led methodologies, and it's really about trying to find oneself within research, for example. And you tend to see that particularly with Pacific peoples who are growing up in New Zealand that wants to be more connected to their countries of heritage, for example. So that's one element. But when you hear it from the Pacific, when they mean Pacific-led, they mean, can you align your development cooperation to our priorities? These are our priorities. And this is where we want you to focus on. So it's more like driving the development agenda based on what they prioritize. Now, given where we are, there's a disconnect there because we just saw the perception around, for example, the China risk. And that perception is prevalent in New Zealand, but it's a perception that's prevalent Australia and elsewhere. And that drives, for example, some of the development cooperation. So that in itself is a disconnect. Because what you're seeing is a lot of that support that's provided is going for security, whereas Pacific is saying, actually, our priorities is so-and-so. So that's another element of Pacific-led initiative, right? What you tend to find is sometimes you inflate those and use them in the same context. So someone going over saying, we're using Talanoa to drive a certain initiative, but it's really driven by some strategic interest, right? So that's when it's not really Pacific-led. It's co-opted framework to take forward an initiative under a Pacific metaphor.
Oh, this could be very broad-ranging. But if I think about Pacific-led in the context of Pacific leadership politically, I can say very honestly, when you're sitting at the Pacific Leaders Forum table with all of the other Pacific countries, everyone is equally weighted at that table, and I think that's important to note, whether you are Niue with a population of 1,200 or you're Australia. And New Zealand and Australia, I think, are very mindful of the fact that their voice is just one amongst many Pacific leaders in the room, and so are always cognizant of the fact that when we talk too much, it is not appreciated. But then I think what's important following those meetings is what happens next. You know, when our Pacific leaders from across the region put on the table that climate change is their biggest challenge, and we as leaders, New Zealand and Australia included, are sitting there accepting that is the case and in agreement, then what do we do when we go home with respect to our policy is the question. And so Pacific-led leadership certainly is happening at that table, but then when everyone goes back to their own homes and makes policy decisions about what they're going to do in those areas that have been highlighted by Pacific leaders across the region as being of the utmost importance, I think that is really the challenge. And so, I mean, I could go into great detail about my concern for climate change and the impacts on the Pacific region and the fact that our leaders are calling for us to take action, and yet we're in this predicament where we've got a country and a government who are making decisions that mean an enhanced focus on fossil fuels, which seems to kind of contradict what is being asked for by our Pacific neighbours. And so I guess the point for me is that there are certainly forums politically where it feels like there is the opportunity for our Pacific countries to lead and speak out on what is important. But is that having the impact on the policies of our country? And are we honouring the call from them to take leadership on particular issues? And I'm not sure that that's the case in different areas.
Sarah or Joe, moving on. I hope you've been thinking up some good questions. Sione made a really interesting point before about the the research is obviously focused on New Zealanders' perceptions of the Pacific, but looking at it the other way, this is something that I think we should all be cognizant of. How does the Pacific perceive New Zealand, given that obviously it's a vastly diverse area, but how is New Zealand doing at the moment, given things like some of our approaches to climate and so forth? How is that playing out? What are your sort of impressions of how New Zealanders perceived?
It's perceived very well. I mean, it's like I said before, New Zealand has a really good legacy and voice within Pacific, particularly Polynesia. And that goes back to the long history of New Zealand supporting the Pacific. And obviously there are things that happen domestically which weren't great. But by and large, for example, nuclear testing, that was something where New Zealand stood with the Pacific. So that element still exists, but what I would say is that it's perhaps been watered down a little bit, particularly with what's currently happening at the moment in the geopolitical strategic level. Because, as I said, there seems to be a disconnect there between what the Pacific wants and some of the political posturing that's happening. That said, I think at the grassroots level, it's very strong because there's a strong cultural connection, family connection. For example, Pacific people moving from New Zealand back to the Pacific. I mean, and I say that generally around Polynesia and a few others, not the whole of the Pacific. So that exists, and if I was to bet, I would bet that would continue to strengthen at the cultural level. But that provides a big issue because if that's happening at the grassroots level and yet the political discourse is not aligning, then fundamentally there's going to be some issues.
Yeah, I know, I would agree. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the strength of our Pacific diaspora here in New Zealand and the family connections that exist between New Zealand Pacific and the Pacific region. I can remember being at a meeting in the Pacific with Penny Wong, who was fascinated with the fact that we take Pacific missions to the Pacific with a delegation of Pacific business people and community leaders from New Zealand who share the Pacific ethnicity with the countries that we're going to. I have numerous examples of where that was actually like really helpful, but also just something to be admired. One I will mention is when I led one of those
Pacific mission delegations to the Pacific, and we went to the Solomons. We took a Dr. Kabini Sanga, who is a Pacific academic of Solomon Islands, descent, heritage, born and raised there. Now, little did we know, well, we should have known, that Dr. Kabini Sanga had gone to school or grown up with just about every political leader that we came across when we were in the Solomons. And you had these very staunch male political leaders all of a sudden reduced to young schoolboys having their conversations in the corner. And I think we shouldn't underestimate those connections. They're incredibly important. And even Minister Penny Wong from Australia was really interested in the fact that we have that. Going back to something I said earlier about the number of Pacific leaders that have some connection and relationship to New Zealand. So many of them came here as scholarship students. So they have very fond memories of their time with New Zealand and with the people that they formed relationships with. And they love to share those stories. And so there is depth to the relationship that exists outside of just some kind of bilateral relationship where you're trying to, with some agenda, get something done or over the line. There's actually real depth there, and I think it's important to note that. And I have to say too, finally, with our own foreign affairs approach, I think it's been a bit trial and error over the decades. But I think that from my own observations, and I'm not in government, so I don't have to say this, that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has really grown and really learnt over the years and works really constructively with our Pacific peoples in the Pacific region and the different Pacific countries. And I think that, I'm really proud of the relationship that they've built. It's something to continue to build on. But that has come from trial and error over many decades. And I think, though, that our diplomats have really earned the trust of our Pacific countries as well.
Good shout out there for MFAT. Thank you. Sarah, before we go to the audience, do you want to talk a little bit about the security situation, which seems to be generating a heck of a lot of noise, not only in New Zealand, but in other places around the world about perceived efforts by China to gain influence in the Pacific and so forth, and responses to against that. How much of this is noise? What is happening here?
It's a very complex topic, and it comes down to what Camille and Sione talk about, perceptions and influence. And in security theory, we look at the two sides, the two perceptions. The traditional security theory that prioritize defense capability and military, and most of the Western countries are aligning with that idea. And the other side of non-traditional security is where the Pacific are, where climate change is the number one security issue. So my question that I always wonder, how can we meet in the middle when it come to diplomatic relations, to discussions, important issues? Because for New Zealand, China is their number one trading partner, and we see the influence of China within the Pacific on infrastructure, on development, which the Pacific needed. But if we look at it from a Pacific perspective, what is security? What does security mean for the Pacific? It is more than just that whole concept. But security theorists and academics, they warned us about having to prioritize one perspective of another. So again, there's need to be a balanced approach, because security for the Pacific, it's about the people, first and foremost. It's about the land and environment. And we see the issue with climate change, with Tuvalu, and the Pacific having the largest economic exclusive economic zone, the threat to seabed mining and tuna fisheries, and so there's a lot of issues along the security spectrum. But the important point for me is for New Zealand and the Pacific to be able to come at the negotiating table and be able to understand each perspectives and where can we agree, even agree to disagree in some points, but putting people first, I think, and value them in the security aspect is really important. And I think that's still a challenge with the geopolitical issues that's going on, whether the Pacific choose China or the traditional alliances. And we see the many policies from New Zealand, foreign policies to the Pacific, these phrases of like-minded partners, of interest. But I think the world has changed with the global dynamic. We don't see a relationship and alliances. They're no longer based on values. They are now based on interest. Pacific-New Zealand relationship is not that. It's much more than, it's not similar interest. It's about values because we share the same culture, we share the same ideas of liberal democratic values. And that's something that New Zealand should be focusing on bridging that gap and expanding the knowledge, I think, beyond to our community at large.
Well said. Thank you, Sarah. Frank, do you want to kick us off with a question?
I can just go and stand here. Oops, Daisy. Thank you. I thought that was fabulous presentations. I'm certainly more knowledgeable, and I'm from Sweden. And when I'm in Stockholm, I always brag that I live on an island in the Pacific, and that's this island. And I'm very proud of it, and I think it's the best place to be in the world. And when you get that far away, it's all sort of comes together. Like New Zealanders talk about Europe as one thing, but Norway and Greece are very different things and far away from each other. And the other thing I wanted to say is last week we had a EU summit here with 500 delegates, many from overseas. And the Pacific was mentioned at least 10 times during the conference. And there were 5 New Zealand ministers at the conference. And they all repeated, I think, the same phrase, that New Zealand is the gateway to the Pacific. So that sort of shows, I think, how proud New Zealand is to have that asset, because far away, the Pacific is something absolutely unique that has value for New Zealand also, to be that intermediary potentially for investment and so forth. So I think the Pacific has a great thing to sell, namely its uniqueness and also its smallness. If donors want to make an impact, there's nowhere in the world where it's easier to make an impact than in the Pacific, because it's so relatively tiny. But if I come to my question, I would just like to say also that the geopolitical thing that you described is very interesting. And of course, there's been a great effort to try to force people to choose either you're with us or you're with us. And I think every nation in the world needs to fight that because it's a matter of working together across all the borders. And I particularly appreciate your explanation there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Try to answer that, but there was no question.
An interesting point about New Zealand being a so-called gateway for external people. If the panel have any views on whether some caution needs to be exerted on that.
Well, I mean, it's like Mangere being the gateway to Aotearoa. I think some caution needs to be exercised when saying that because we cannot have that attitude that the Pacific can only be accessed through New Zealand. That is that kind of patriarchal attitude that I feel like New Zealand has parked. and moved on from. And so, I mean, technically, quite often it's very hard to get like geographically to the Pacific unless you come through New Zealand, but not always the case. And we need to be careful of the other meaning of that. And I think we've seen in recent years many countries are having conversations with Pacific nations, and New Zealand cannot be a barrier or block to that occurring. And so we just need to focus on our relationship and not try and make out that every other country needs to come through us to have access to Pacific countries, because that's simply not the case.
Thank you for your discussion here. I've actually got a different mindset where I'm sort of sitting here from someone who was an ex-journo and then newspaper owners throughout the Pacific. I still believe the colonial mindset is very much in place. In 2015, the UN passed a resolution to get rid of all colonial states. 10 years later, it's still there. Nothing's changed. Australia, 6 months later, went in and took over Norfolk Island. They got the Otaheite people of Makutumotu, you may know as French Polynesia, the Kanaks. That still sits for the UN Committee of 28 that decides on the independence. We can't even get New Zealand pushing for that. We've got Russia kicked off at the moment, so you've got a great opportunity because they had to deal with the French to stop it. So what I'm saying is, now's the time. We've got to get rid of that colonial mindset. Enough years of running a magazine up there and seeing the same mindset in place.
So what do we think?
So I'm saying to you, how much has that colonial mindset gone, both in trade and, as you say, still relying on our indentured labour, I call down here, and being an ex-orchardist in terms of our own income and where it would come from if we didn't on that attitude. So I'm sorry to put a negative mind on that, but it's got to be said because I think I'm in the wrong place, and I'm just supporting, as a Christian World Service representative, is that the South Pacific Council of Churches, from the spiritual side of it, are still pushing for the full independence of the people in the Pacific. So let's start spiritually. That's the main key thing. Sorry about that, my preaching.
What's your views on the persistence of colonisation in the Pacific?
I mean, there's different ways to look at it, right? So when I was saying that New Zealand's a very Pacific country, I was talking about it in the context of the cultural grassroots level. When you think about these issues, particularly around the decolonization project, it's actually quite ironic because there's all this talk about needing to integrate more with the Pacific. And yet some would argue that the Pacific has never been disintegrated because a lot of parts of the Pacific is still, very much under colonial rule. And they're still struggling for that self-determination. But I think when we start talking about those issues, you can't talk about those issues without talking about the broader strategic issues at play. And, oh, sorry, that's my phone ringing. This is, it's my son. He's been, yeah. Anyways, you can't talk about those issues. For example, the issue of West Papua, I've been involved in that issue of West Papua for a long time. And that's steeped, for example, in security strategic issues. It's steeped, for example, in strategic partnerships. And if you think about the decolonization project now, in the context of the geopolitics that's happening and the various alliances you need to form, then it becomes, just looking at it purely from that level, it becomes, I wouldn't say you can understand why people, but there's a reason why countries take the positions that they do. Obviously, if you're looking at purely from a human rights perspective, then it's fundamental that everyone has the right to exercise self-determination. And that's always been the issue in the Pacific, is that there's still a lot of people in the Pacific who still are not able to exercise that right.
I was trying to come in with a positive view, but you're not wrong.
Any of the students in the room? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Mairi Ledbeater, and really pleased that Sione brought up West Papua, because that's been my concern for many decades. And I think New Zealand does need to play a role, because the human rights situation just gets worse and worse. I mean, we're talking now about 100,000 people displaced in the highlands. And if that were happening anywhere else in the Pacific, everyone would know about it. But New Zealanders aren't aware. And the other thing they aren't aware, which is also very much in our interest and in the interest of everybody in the world, is the fact that in the south of West Papua at the moment is a huge land clearing project. And I watched a webinar with Grant Rossman of Greenpeace, who described this. It's forest clearing, of course, where Indigenous people depend for their livelihoods, but he described it as the largest land clearing project in the world. Now, I mean, even if that's not right, it's huge. It's absolutely massive. And the impact of that on climate change is something we just seem to be ignoring, you know, and surely other Pacific neighbours also must care about that, because they don't want their islands washed away. And the kind of admissions coming from that land clearing project are really serious. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to put in my plug. If you don't know much about West Papua, there's an amazing documentary called The Promise, and it's showing at the Capitol on the 23rd of November. And it's from the Dutch perspective, but it really does put the history, which I think people need to understand. Thank you.
Well done. Good plug. Any thoughts or response?
Oh, can I ask a quick question while I have the microphone to Carmel? My name is George Andrews. We've met. I was interested in your admiration of MFAT for the way they're so positive towards the Pacific Islands. My question is, what went wrong in the Cooks?
You want the tea? No. And so, you know, me saying that about MFAT is not just from me. That is certainly the feedback that I've got from Pacific leaders and others that are living in Pacific countries in terms of their attitude towards the New Zealand Ministry for Foreign Affairs. What went wrong with the Cooks? Okay, so I think much of it was reported publicly. I went back to that 2001 agreement that was signed by the Labour government of the time, and it was a kind of reset of that relationship with the Cooks. To be fair, and I've said this to a number of people, I don't know whether that was as clear as what it probably needed to be. There was a two-way expectation on conversations and decisions for security in the region. I don't know if there's always been two-way conversations, to be honest. However, in saying that, there are other Pacific nations who looked at what was happening in the Cooks and felt that back in the 1960s, when so many of them were making the decisions about what the future of their country would look like, made the determination to separate from New Zealand so that they could have the independence to have the international relations that they would be allowed if they were separate from New Zealand. And there's some that signed up to an agreement whereby they had an obligation to work with New Zealand with that regard. When this all broke, there's at least one who said, we signed up to this, and yet now they get to have New Zealand citizenship plus the things that we wanted with our independence. What's going on here? So there was a pretty clear understanding across the Pacific what countries signed up to at that time. we love the Cook Islands, but there does need to be a level of communication that I think that has been missing. And so you won't always find us agreeing with Winston on things, but we were in agreement mostly on this. It's just, come on, what's going on? We need to be talking about this. If you're making agreements to this extent that include deep sea mining and other things, then New Zealand really needs to be involved from the outset, and they weren't. And so I hope that New Zealand and the Cook Islands can sit around the table and sort this out and come to an agreement, because it's very sad for all of us when New Zealand couldn't even send a formal delegation of government ministers to the recent anniversary of our joined relationship. I'm not sure if they're there yet. I haven't caught up on where that is at, but I'm hoping that we'll be there soon if we're not there yet.
Can I just interrupt that? Because the Defence White Paper written to the New Zealand Defence Force to cover all New Zealand interests in it, but supposedly we have this relationship.
Well, I think this is what I'm saying. I don't know if we've honoured it in the two-way intention that was set out at least in the 2001 report, and I think that that's something that New Zealand needs to reflect on.
Catherine and Marco, maybe the three at the back.
Thanks, and thanks very much for a really fascinating discussion and presentation. I'd like to come back to the perceptions report that was presented at the outset and the recommendations that were made in there, which I think are super helpful. And I'd really appreciate the views of the panellists on the current gaps between New Zealand's Pacific policies and approaches and what's recommended from those findings that you've had from the survey. If you could take one thing that you would think New Zealand should do to change its approach to working with the Pacific, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to climate change again. And if we're genuine about the relationship that we have with the Pacific, and we're going to sit around the table with leaders who are saying that climate change is a priority, then New Zealand needs to be world leading and need to demonstrate through our actions that we are actually honouring what we've been told by Pacific leaders is the most important thing. And I don't feel like we are right now, to be honest. So, I mean, I would go back to that. But then I'd also go to the workforce side of things. I feel like New Zealand takes a lot of workers from the Pacific, and I worry that that two-way labour mobility is not happening and that we don't have the initiatives and projects in place where we're actually, say, encouraging our diaspora to go back and contribute to the countries that they have shared heritage with, where we're not training up and providing the technical support so that they have the people skilled in the areas where they have workforce shortages. And so I think that there's a lot to do in those two areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a fundamental issue, particularly of labour mobility, because by and large, there's a high demand in the Pacific for mobility. What that looks like, I think, is the challenge. Making sure that whatever you do from a policy perspective, you're not further adding social challenges, labor shortages, and things like that. And that's not an easy issue to try and resolve. Because I know it's also a very political issue for a lot of the Pacific countries as well. You know, if they sort of try and stop it, or at least they also get some pushback even within their own domestic communities as well. So I think that's a challenge. I'll probably go back to say that when I first started in the Pacific, whenever you went to something, they always said, okay, what's the priority? You were always sort of looking for that magic solution. And I think, if I did take some learnings from the Pacific, it's not so much the magic priority or a specific area. It's more about how you go about doing it and doing it right. And I think that's probably, if there are challenges, particularly in New Zealand's cooperation with the Pacific, I think it's more that. It's not so much if it's climate, what is it? Because you're not going to resolve the climate issue by just saying, here's a bunch of money. There has to be some method behind doing it properly. And I think that's also an issue because, for example, there's been a lot of criticism, for example, of China for just, no governance around the money that they give, for example, accountability, that sort of stuff. So I think it's a nuanced approach, but it has to be based, I think, going back to that issue that you asked, Hamish, about has to be Pacific-led. Like, it has to be aligned to Pacific priorities, because otherwise the disconnect will still be there.
Joanna, do you want to come? Did you on those on your roadmap? What was your sort of highest priority? Would you say?
I suppose I'll just talk from the programming that we do and around education with our sort of like our scholars. And so, I've invited here this evening our Manaaki scholars, and these are people that we invest in. We bring them here to New Zealand and we send them back home. We're sending them home with skills, but can those skills actually be put into practice? So I think it's around making sure that when we are investing in these people that we're bringing to our country, that it's not just in skills, it's a whole approach that's sustainable, and that we're actually building their futures beyond just skills. So I think that's a huge priority for PCF that aligns with our work program. And so I see that as a priority, that we can't just bring people here and say, we're investing in them, we're educating them, but how do they put those skills into use? And we found in the last few years that our scholars that we're building strong relationships with, and we're in introducing them to corporate New Zealand, but also small businesses, they're saying, how can we get more of that help when we return home? So I think that is a priority, and does tie back to that labour mobility, but also that workforce development that we're seeing in the region, that it's an overall approach. And I think we need to stop looking at silos and start looking at a more approach that involves everybody. So that's my piece.
Good point. Marco and
thank you. Marco, I'm Sioni's colleague at AUT and I'm a Pacific historian. I just thought, building off Catherine's question and turning to the perceptions report, I thought, reading between the lines, the kind of report makes this case for people-to-people ties being the basis for New Zealand's responsible soft power in the region. I found it interesting that only 7% identified, with deep knowledge of the region, and, that the overwhelming priorities for New Zealand's engagement were in education and health. I thought that, maybe this reflects perhaps a misunderstanding of New Zealand's strategic interests and the current trajectory of our own foreign policy, however, which is shifting very clearly from diplomacy and development towards defence. And I thought, just looking at the news this week, we can look at the South Pacific Defence Ministers meeting, expanded PRG remit, or we can look at New Zealand's own declining ODA. I thought, is the connection gap not between the New Zealand public and our foreign policy making?
Well, I agree with you on our soft power being our people-to-people connections, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. There was an expectation, I read this in Newsroom, others might have read this too, that the Minister for Foreign Affairs put forward a bid in combination or together with the Minister for Defence. And I saw that he was opposed to it. Well, at least that's what it said in the media. And I thought, actually, I don't know why it has to be together. all the time, and there's so much more happening in the foreign affairs space that isn't necessarily defence. And I think that we need to look more broadly on what our relationships and connections are that make us unique to the Pacific region as well. I happen to go in a personal capacity to the Pacific Arts Festival that's hosted every 4 years in the Pacific region. Was it last year I went, or was it? It was last year. And it was hosted by Hawaii. You had over 2,000 artists and thousands of others that went to participate and watch that. You had politicians from around the Pacific region that were there to support their countries. New Zealand government was not present. And it's like, do you realise how much our arts, culture, heritage, language means to this region? It's another point of difference for New Zealand's connection, and we weren't present. And so I worry that we are too narrow in our thinking sometimes, and perhaps there's the defence considerations that need to be had and discussions that need to be held. But our relationship goes beyond just a defence function, and I think that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of those other areas and the connections that New Zealand uniquely holds.
Malolele, I'm Karanina. Just a question. So there was a RNZ story today about the reduction in funding, and not talking about labour mobility, etc. But what impact will that have on the pursuit of gender equality, for example, in the Pacific, which has been a big thing for the Pacific Forum for so long, so much investment. So I'm really concerned about that. And also, I noticed that the graph of expenditure of aid for Australia is much more significant compared to us. We're going to reduce. Has there been some sort of deal made that Australia will become the kaitiaki of the Pacific and we're stepping back?
Again, I can only speculate on what I've seen in the media, but certainly what's been reported recently was that there was an expectation from the Minister of Finance that the Minister for Foreign Affairs reprioritise the Pacific ODA budget towards the climate challenges and demands that New Zealand needs to meet and the expectations of the Pacific region. Now, when you're reprioritising, of course, you're taking away from other places. And I don't think that that should be our expectation of the Foreign Affairs Minister or of the Foreign Affairs budget. Where are we going to take from, and what will that have an impact on? So all of those programs that are important for us meeting our the International Sustainable Development Goals, are they supposed to be compromised because of the fact that we do need to invest in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and to support our Pacific region with that? I don't think so. And so clearly, I think there has been some discussions internally. Perhaps at the most recent budget, the Minister for Foreign Affairs didn't necessarily get the amount of money to meet the outcomes and the goals that he had. I think that was reported on. I can't say I had a conversation with him about that. And that's disappointing, I think, in terms of our relationship with the Pacific and what not just the Pacific expects of us, but clearly what New Zealand expects of us too. You need to answer the next one.
I mean, just to answer the other issue around gender, I mean, it's a big issue in the Pacific across the board, whether it's gender-based violence, gender empowerment, women in business. It's an issue in the Pacific, but I'm not entirely sure. This is just my own perspective. I'm not entirely sure whether it's solely around financing or there's a deeper issue, cultural aspect to why there's such slow progress in the Pacific with respect to gender. It's always been on the regional agenda. Some time back, there was a lot of money that came through DFAT. The EU put a lot of money in the gender space. I think some of that money, and this is probably goes to the security issue, but some of that money has now been repackaged as women and peace, for example. But progress, if you're just looking at measurable progress, there really hasn't been any. I struggle to come up with an answer for that, apart from saying that there's some deep barriers in the Pacific, and I do think some of that is embedded also in some cultural aspect as well.
Just go one last question before we.
Thank you. I wanted to know your thoughts on the current PAC scheme conditions, that it's a ballot system and actually have really strict conditions on you have a disability or a health condition. It's very hard to move to New Zealand. If you have any thoughts, and also if climate is what is the main issue in the Pacific, this scheme doesn't take into account the personal circumstances of the people, including whether if they're impacted by climate, and your thoughts on the current Whalepili agreement, which allows people to move with free movement. It means that they are not tied to a visa that have to go to Australia when the visa conditions say, or when they want to move and come back to Paolo. Thank you.
So the first part of that question was on people with health conditions and disabilities and their ability to move to New Zealand. Oh, I've had many constituent cases of this nature. The particular area that concerns me is when you have people who have moved here with children and they're making a valuable contribution in the jobs that they're working in, and then they have one child or a child who has a disability of some sort. And the assumption from Immigration New Zealand is that that child is going to be a drain on the health fiscal envelope. And so therefore their visas are declined and they're told that that child cannot come to New Zealand and basically the whole family have to move back to where they came from. I've got a real issue with that. And I think that is something, and I've said this in the past, that should be looked at in terms of our immigration policy. There are broader, things to talk about when it comes to health and disability and Immigration New Zealand's expectations. But we've had so many cases, particularly with children, that it certainly makes me think that Immigration New Zealand need to take a look at that. Not sure if you want to answer.
I think that's a great question. With regard to what Carmen was saying, so the immigration policies in New Zealand, there's a requirement for health and character for every visa application, and that's a must. So with child with disability, I don't know whether there's any category that could accept that, which I don't think so, because you either meet, like I said before, health, you must meet health requirements, you must meet character requirements in order for the visa to be processed. And I think the International General Secretary of Amnesty was here in New Zealand not long ago, and she spoke about that case about the mother and the child as an example, but also the need for New Zealand to step up in terms of climate refugee, for example. The Whalepili agreement that Australia offered the Tuvalu is something that perhaps New Zealand can look at in terms of policy. So.
Maybe just one on the Whalepili. I mean, I note that from on one side of Whalepili, because it's to do also with a visa, climate pathway visa to Australia, that some commentators have said that's a very good thing. And I think in the context of progressing international law, particularly in that context, it does provide some precedents. But personally, I do have a fundamental issue with trading away sovereignty to be able to assist a country in need, particularly on an issue that they didn't have much to do with. So that agreement itself, I do have a fundamental problem because of the transactional nature of it and the power imbalance by which those transactions are made.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm terribly sorry we're out of time, and we can hopefully close the connection gap over some food and drink at the back. But before we wrap, I'd just like to invite Francesca Long, the chair of the Auckland branch, to say something.
Before Francesca speaks, if you see me slip out, I have the Kelston Boys Sports Prize giving this evening that I have to speak at. And they've been going through a bit this week, so I do need to go to Kelston Boys College. Apologies.
So with that, we better make it quick. And I know you're all hungry, and thank you all for, paying attention for the last hour and a half. So you guys all deserve the food. But why don't we give a round of applause to all of our speakers today? Thank you so much. Thank you, Honourable Carmel. Thank you, Mr. Sione. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Joe, as well. And of course, Honourable Carmel won't be here, but the other speakers will be lingering around. So feel free to ask your questions if you didn't get to ask it. But also thank you to Hamish, our Executive Director, for moderating today. So enjoy. I hope you guys a really safe trip home as well. All the food is there for you. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.